Hello and welcome to my talk, Extreme Learning Situations as Testers, How to Add Value While You're Still Learning. My name is Christian Baumann and I'm a software tester. For more about me, you can check out my Twitter. There's a link to my different profiles in my bio. When tweeting about this talk, please use the hashtag EclipseCon. So, let's start. Let me explain you what this talk is about. When joining a new project or taking on a new role, it is often required to learn new skills and technologies. Be it a new business domain, a new tool, a new technology the product is built with, a new test technique or kind of testing, or whatever else. Also, we often feel the need, or are told of the need, to provide value to the project quickly. Both of these competing expectations are normal to a certain degree, and working in IT, we're used to that, be it as testers, programmers, or whatever our job title is. When I started a new job at a fintech startup earlier this year, joining a project where it was my task to test an API against the European Union standard for payment services, I had to do both to an extreme I had never experienced before. The list of things to learn from almost the ground was long. But first, let's briefly talk about the application under test. The Payment Service Directive PSD2 is an EU directive to regulate payment services throughout the European Union. Basically, banks have to have a standardized API for so-called third-party providers, which can be used by merchants to access end clients' account informations and to initiate payments. The two most relevant points are it's a REST API, and the specification comes from a European institution, thus is relatively difficult to comprehend because of its very official language. So, the main things I needed to learn were testing an API. I basically knew what an API is. You send a request and get some data back. But how to test that? I needed to perform exploratory testing in order to learn about the API and find problems. Automate the tests using Postman. We had promised our clients to give them a set of Postman tests, so they would be able to perform some checks on their own, so Postman was set. Also, for banks in Luxembourg, the financial regulator demanded performance tests being executed. Beyond being aware of the existence of some API testing tools like Postman and SoapUI, my knowledge about API testing was quite close to zero. I also had to learn the specification, which consisted of 400 pages, authored by a public institution, very detailed, overstructured, and overcomplete, thus quite difficult to comprehend. Finally, I had to learn the business domain. I never worked in the financial industry before, so I had to at least grasp the basics. What's a consent and how does it work? How does a payment work? What different types of payments exist and how do they differ? To name just a few things to be learned within the business domain. Despite all these things to learn, other project members were expecting valuable contributions from me shortly after joining. Luckily, nobody ever put any direct pressure on me. Just certain things were in the room, plus the pressure I put myself under. But that might be different in other contexts. Some expectations. I joined April 1st. The instructed go-live date for the UAT environments was June 14th, so that was roughly 2.5 months. It was expected that the system is completely tested, whatever completely tested means, before that date. Another expectation was that I should find all the bugs, which is another very questionable statement. The test automation should be fast-forwarded. Also, the Postman tests needed to be completed to be delivered to our clients. When I joined, only skeletons existed and only for a fraction of cases. Performance tests needed to be done before the end of April. So let me share with you some stories of my project and explain the strategies, techniques, and tools I used to deal with all the competing requirements. First of all, it is important to find out about what the most important priority is or what the most important priorities are, so that you have a starting point. But how to do that? Initially, Talk to the people involved in the project and to the stakeholders about what their priorities are. Question those priorities. Ask why those are priorities to them. Often, there will be misalignments between different people involved in the project, and it's part of our job as testers to spot and clarify them. Second, bring your own judgment as tester to the table. You're a skilled and experienced professional, and you're totally able to get the job done. That's the reason you got hired or assigned. So don't be shy. You have something to bring to the table. Bringing your judgment to the table might change estimates, deadlines, or priorities. For example, someone with little to zero knowledge might have given a totally unrealistic estimate about how much time is needed to set up and execute performance tests. Ask questions like, what exactly shall be achieved? What is required or shall be done? What is the goal? At least certain aspects of the project and the priorities might change because of that, and it will result in a clearer view on what is a priority. Third point about finding out about priorities is to check deadlines and plan accordingly. This planning should be updated regularly by redoing the before mentioned steps, but also based on your learnings, new inputs, and insights. Next, I'll talk about how I handled multiple parallel tasks throughout the project. We all know that multitasking is far from being ideal, but sometimes it's hard to get around it. Okay, if you cannot avoid multitasking, be at least aware of the negative effects it has, and your boss should be aware of these too. You get tired faster, you easily feel overwhelmed, and you tend to make more mistakes. Most important thing to consider is focus. Things that help to focus on a specific task are: avoid task switching too often. Stay focused. Work in bigger blocks of at least 2 hours to avoid too much task switching. If you have too many meetings, try to block time in your calendar for working. Task switching costs up to 40% of someone's productive time. There are various studies on that with very different numbers, but this is not about the absolute truth, but to get an idea. Come to the office early or stay late. Not to work over hours, but early and late, the office is relatively quiet and there are less people there to disturb you. Another possibility to avoid the usual office distractions is to work from home. Well, before the pandemic and the kids being homeschooled all day. A great tool to use is the Pomodoro Technique. Pomodoro is Italian and means tomato. The technique has that name because of those old-fashioned kitchen timers that often have the shape of a tomato. How does the technique work? Basically, you work on a task in blocks of 25 minutes, followed by a 5 minutes break. Within that 25 minutes, you don't work on anything else and avoid any distractions. No emails, no phone calls, no WhatsApp, no Facebook. Every 4 blocks, you take a bigger break of around 20 minutes. Besides focusing, what are other ways to handle multitasking if you think you cannot avoid it? First of all, evaluate if you really have to multitask. Talk to your stakeholders and your boss. Tell them, for example, do you want both of these tasks to be ready in 2 weeks? Or is it okay to focus on one at a time? Deliver the first one by the end of this week and the second task done by the end of next week? Most likely I will be done with both tasks in less than 2 weeks because I'm not losing time due to task switching. Next, you should evaluate if you can eliminate unnecessary things, or if there are things that you can supervise or delegate. Also check what you can simplify. Here's some other advantages of the Pomodoro technique come into play. Pomodoro helps you learning to concentrate and to work in blocks of time, what I said earlier. It also is a great help in avoiding procrastination and distraction. You also should make a plan and establish personal goals. For that, I can recommend the book Pomodoro Technique Illustrated by Staffan Noteberg. Techniques like bullet journaling or momentum planners also help with that. You need to align your priorities regularly. For that, you should check with the team, the stakeholders, and your boss. It is also very important to accept your limits, to work at a sustainable pace, and take breaks when you need them. Let's talk about learning while doing. How does learning an instrument work? Do you study music theory for a couple of years and only when you master it, access an instrument for the very first time? Certainly not. The instructor tells you just a tiny little bit on how to get started. You practice that. And with each lesson, you learn and practice a little bit more about every aspect. Theory and practice about how to play that instrument, and over time, you become proficient. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect from the beginning. Very often, it doesn't even need to be perfect in the end, but that's a topic for a talk on its own. I didn't have the time to first acquire all the necessary skills, not even talking about bringing them to perfection. I followed a similar approach as when learning an instrument, just studying enough to get me started. Then try to use that and improve over time. Let me give you an example of that. When I arrived, in the existing Postman tests, there was a gap. You had to copy a URL from Postman, paste it into the browser, and perform an action on a website, then continue the flow in Postman. The project manager, who initially created that tests, thought that Postman is for APIs only. But it's for all kinds of HTTP requests. And this is basically what a browser is doing, sending HTTP requests and displaying and rendering the returned HTML. With my previous web UI automation knowledge, I was able to bridge that gap and automate the whole flow in Postman, which enabled us to run the Postman tests via continuous integration. Not the biggest progress in testing the API, but I learned a lot about Postman and especially about JavaScript. Also, we could execute the tests fully automated and unattended, without any manual interaction, and that was a great step forward. Another example is my workflow in the first weeks for creating a test in Postman. First, I created only the request to create an item via the API without any tests. I then added more requests to the workflow, for example, to retrieve the newly created item from the API. I then added tests, for example, to check if the request returned the correct HTTP status code, if the created items are correct, and so on. Next step was to parameterize the requests and the tests. For example, the URL was unique per each client, so I introduced variables instead of hard-coding that values. I left the difficult parts until the very end. For example, how to iterate over a nested JSON array with JavaScript to check specific values within the JSON data. To not bring something to perfection, but only to a good enough state, is an often used principle and is applied in many engineering disciplines, and it also makes sense in software projects. Another thing that can save you a lot of time is to look out for patterns. If you often have to do the same or similar tasks, it can make sense to set up a general structure or process, a kind of blueprint that you can reuse. This can save you a lot of time. The point is, you should not end up doing like the guy on the right. During the course of the project, it turned out that we not only had to do performance testing in one sandbox environment, as it was initially announced, but the Luxembourgish regulator demanded that the UAT environment of every client also needed to be performance tested and to be compliant with the performance requirements. In our case, the UAT environments were a pre-production environment, which are linked to the client's test environment, whereas the sandbox environments only had a database with some fake test data. By the way, let's have a look at the requirements for that performance tests demanded by the regulator. First, capability of the dedicated interface to support access by multiple merchants at the same time. This to ensure that each merchant can only access the data of its own clients. To me, this is more functional than a performance requirement. Second, capability of the dedicated interface to deal with extremely high numbers of requests. Okay, this makes sense for a performance test, but what is an extremely high number? This was up for the clients to decide and has led us to some very interesting conversations, as some clients had really unrealistic ideas about what an extremely high number of requests is. Third, use of an extremely high number of concurrent open sessions, i.e. open at the same time. This definitely makes no sense for an API, as there are no open sessions. You send a request, you get a response. End of story. But no sessions like in web applications, for example. Guess someone at the regulator simply copy-pasted from some other template, but as my colleagues could tell me from earlier experiences, arguing with the regulator about their requirements would have been totally pointless. Finally, requests for large volumes of data. This one also makes sense, but what does large mean? The typical requests and responses for that API have a couple of kilobytes in size. Initially, we had a hard time to explain clients that we don't want to move mega or even gigabytes of data, as that's not a very realistic use case. But that was their idea of large volumes of data. Back to me, trying to improve my process and toolset. At first, we discussed the client's needs for the performance tests in UAT with each client individually, leading to very different requirements for each client, especially concerning things like, what is the duration of one performance test run? How many parallel users should be used during a performance test run? What is a large volume of data? What's an extremely high number of concurrent open sessions? And many, many more. Additionally, we didn't use a proper performance test tool, but some command line tools that simply executed the postman tests in parallel, which was a nightmare to maintain, and also the reporting was pretty bad and required a lot of manual effort. But initially, it was meant to be a one-time thing, and thus okay. It was, no surprise, not maintainable for more than 20 clients. So I drafted performance tests for each of the criteria of the regulator in JMeter and explained those in a document we handed out to the client. A lot of values had to be set by us, which avoided a lot of discussions with the clients. Some values, like the number of parallel users per test, were based on usage data of the client's web banking, and those we asked the clients to provide them to us. I then set up a little framework in the performance test tool JMeter, which I could easily reuse. Values that changed per client could be adapted via a handful of config files with very little effort. But be careful. Getting things up and running and maintaining them can take a lot of time. Don't maintain a process or an automation solution for just the sake of maintaining something, but only do so if you benefit from it. The shown comic is about automating a repetitive task with the intent to do a one-time effort to automate that task and spend time in the long run. But very often, the maintenance and further development of that automation takes more time than it took to manually perform the initial task. Another important thing to do is manage expectations. What you should keep in mind is that expectations are based on what has come before. And because everybody has different experiences and thus different expectations, it's important to make clear to stakeholders what to expect. Keep your stakeholders informed, because nobody likes surprises. Talk to your stakeholders regularly and let them know what you achieved and what you'll achieve next. Try to give them a timeline. Yes, estimates are difficult, but I'm not talking about absolute figures and promises here, but about when you think you can achieve what. Make clear that you're giving estimates, not promises. Involving people earlier versus surprising them is very effective over time for both building trust and for managing expectations more effectively. Also, you need to clearly articulate the risks you see. You should report obstacles, and especially if you think something is not feasible, that you, for example, cannot reach a deadline or might not be able to acquire the necessary knowledge in the given time. Finally, have a backup plan. This helps to set the frame that things can go wrong, and if they do, nobody is surprised. And if things go wrong, you are prepared. It also shows you've thought through the problem. Besides all the advices and hints how to work on such a project, it's also very important that you stay healthy. For that, you should try to not get overwhelmed by your work. Leave work at work and don't take it home. Let me share a story from a project where I was not able to do so. I was a test project lead for the very first time in my career, and the project was doomed from the very first day. But me as a newbie was not able to see that back then. It was a project in waterfall mode, and there was an intensive 2 weeks testing phase scheduled at the very end, which meant subject matter experts and testers were locked into a room to test quality in. This project was so very much eating me up I had a notepad and pen on my nightstand because I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about stuff I didn't want to forget, so I could write that down. It was a very stressful time and not healthy at all, and over time I learned how to leave work at work. In general, don't get into the hamster wheel. Alex Schladdebeck and Hype Shots gave an impressive keynote about that at Agile Testing Days 2018, and you can find a recording of it on YouTube. So much for my experiences, how I handled the challenges, and what else can work in such a situation. Let's talk about some more general how-to questions. How do you avoid such situations? Are there other people that can help you out, that can join or support the project? Can you find them inside your organization, in your team, in different teams or departments? Or maybe you need to look outside of your organizations. Should someone be hired? Can part of the work be outsourced, or does it make sense to bring consultants on board? If you believe that you're in such a project, make it clear right from the beginning that it is impossible to succeed, but give detailed reasons for why this is the case. How do you recognize and talk about such projects? Ask questions like, do we have the right people and skills? Whom do we have to get on board? How much do we have to learn? What are the deadlines to provide results? Is it feasible? If you're already caught in such a project, try to step back. Get out of the hamster wheel and make yourself aware that you are in such a project. Talking about such projects in your organization can be difficult, depending on the company culture. But you have to raise it anyhow, because if you don't speak up, there's a 100% chance of nothing to be changed. Finally, how to prevent such projects. The mandatory precondition for prevention is that you need to have recognized that such a project is going to happen, and you need to talk about it. What I said about expectation management earlier is key. Manage expectations and take actions to execute the project better. That was my talk. Many thanks for your attention. I hope you found some useful bits for your work.